All right, so a little more chemistry, this time about lipids. So we'll study four basic types of organic molecules. By organic, I mean things with carbon and hydrogen. And we call these biomolecules specifically the ones that are just unique to living things. So lipids, carbohydrates, proteins, and nucleic acids. We'll start with lipids. It's really kind of the different one. And that difference is really important to life. So let's first talk about where do you find lipids? Well, around the house, we find it obviously in really concentrated form in things like oil and butter. All right, so those are mostly lipids. Obviously, lipids or fats are incorporated into other things as well. You know, cookies that have oil, milk, etc. They all have lipids. You find a different kind in chapstick, right? You put that on, and that's a wax, which is also a lipid. And importantly, we talked about it a little bit with the skin in lotions. Lotions are a lot of lipids, fatty acids, and sometimes triglycerides that we would put on the skin to replace the oils that we might have lost. So that's where we would find them. Where do we find them in the body? Well, obviously underneath the skin, that layer underneath is a lot of lipids. That's the subcutaneous fat. In some areas we have it stored more than others, like in the belly and stuff like that. It's doing several things. So kind of jumping right into function along with this, it is energy storage. So the fat underneath our skin stores our extra energy kind of for a rainy day. If we don't use it, then we just keep accumulating it and we get heavier and heavier. But it serves a couple other functions there too. It is a bit of a cushion, right? There's that cushiony aspect to it. If we were to sit down and had no fat on our behind, then it would be a pretty hard seat. So cushioning is important. It also insulates us. So that fat underneath our skin keeps heat from leaving quite so easily from the core of our body. So there's a couple functions. Cushioning also happens a couple other places. So on the function in another where, some of your internal organs, especially around like your kidneys, reproductive organs, have quite a bit of fat around them to cushion them as well. So that's an important one. Our skin itself, not just underneath the skin, but the skin secretes a lot of oils, all kinds of different chemical mixes, some fatty acids, cholesterol, even some triglycerides that it secretes to keep the skin supple and moist so that it's flexible. You know how like a brown paper bag, if it gets grease stains on it, it just stays damp? Basically, that doesn't evaporate out. And so our skin is doing the same sort of thing. If we wash that oil away with soap, then it leaves and our skin gets dry, so we put oils back in with lotions. But we also secrete some, for example, one real sensitive area is the eyelids. So there's quite a bit of oils there, so they stay flexible and kind of lubricated. So when you're opening and closing your eyes, it doesn't get all dried out. That area does get dried out. You know it, your eyes get pretty irritated. We even make some waxes, as we know, in our ears. So there's quite a bit of oils that we produce around our body. Another one that we can't necessarily see on a large scale, but around every single cell, there's a special kind of lipid called a phospholipid that makes up most of that membrane around the cell, separating the inside from the outside. And we'll go into each of those types and look at their structures here in a moment. And then finally, cholesterol. Cholesterol is an important one. We know that it can build up in a bad way, for example, in the arteries, especially the ones going to the heart, and sort of clog those up and decrease blood flow. So that's a bad version, but there's plenty of good cholesterol that circulates around. It also incorporates into the membranes of each of our cells, keeps them just the right fluid level. We also use it to make hormones. So testosterone, estrogen, etc., are made out of cholesterol. And so those are some of the things that it does: cushioning, insulation, energy storage, and even as a hormone, that signal molecule in some cases. Well, a little more tedious, but let's talk about the three different kinds of lipids that I want you to know and be able to recognize their structures. All right, well, the basic building block, if we can call it that, for lipids is the fatty acid. Pretty big molecule, and this one's actually kind of short, just 8 carbons. Usually they're 14 or so long, but just for the sake of space, I made this one a little bit smaller. You can see there's a lot of carbon and a lot of hydrogen, and that's really what sets lipids apart, is it's mostly carbon and hydrogen, a little bit of oxygen down here at this end. All right, so a lot less oxygen than usual. So if you're seeing very little oxygen, lots of carbons and hydrogens, you're thinking probably a lipid. And this is, again, why it does not mix with water very well. Now, another detail, this one is saturated. What I mean by that is all the carbons are saturated with as much hydrogen as they could possibly hold. And these tend to form fairly straight chains, and they pack together closely and typically form things like fats. But if we were to, for example, take away a couple of the hydrogens, now it's not as saturated, these two carbons would then be able to form a double bond just because of those bonding rules, right? Carbon always needs 4 bonds. And so now we would have an unsaturated fatty acid. Not as much hydrogen as we could possibly saturate that with. And usually, though I can't really show it here, this would cause a bend in the molecule. They don't pack together quite as densely and typically form more liquidy substances like oils. All right, so the basic is a fatty acid. These don't repeat themselves in something called monomers that we'll see in carbohydrates and proteins and nucleic acids. They do something a little bit different, and we usually have several fatty acids together, but to link them, we're going to need another molecule, and that's glycerol. So I'm going to draw that over here. All right, so here's my glycerol molecule in orange, just 3 carbons long, and I can link this fatty acid into it. But since all the bonding spaces are full, all the electrons are being shared already, I don't really have a way to do that. So I need to remove a few molecules, and we'll see this theme kind of come up again and again. This is called dehydration synthesis. The dehydration part comes from, I'm going to take out these. What was that? That was 2 H's and an O. In other words, H2O, or water. So we're going to take those out, kind of sloppily. But now those are gone, and the synthesis part means I'm going to put this together. So now carbon has a free bonding space, oxygen gets 2 bonds, and so I can form a bond there. Okay, now I've linked my fatty acid to the glycerol, and I could remove these and link in some other fatty acids here as well. And these could be saturated, unsaturated, they could be long, they could be short, and that's going to give each of these triglycerides now a different chemical character. So this here would be a triglyceride. Okay, so triglyceride has 3 fatty acids linked through a glycerol, and those are the things that form fats and oils, like the oil in that container. Lots of fatty acids joined up to the glycerol, forming triglycerides. The fat underneath our skin, around our organs, same sort of thing. Triglycerides. Lots of energy stored in these guys. Let's look at the other 2 types. The next most logical lipid to talk about is the phospholipid. And here I've drawn one just by modifying what we had a minute ago and adding a phosphate. So instead of a long fatty acid over here, I'm going to add this. Something else we'll come across a lot. This is called a phosphate group. It has phosphorus, 4 oxygens, and do note, really importantly, there's this charge here, this negative charge on that oxygen. So that means that all of this stuff is very non-polar, right? It's just carbon and hydrogen doesn't want to mix with oxygen, but this part is actually ionic. And so that gives this chemical really special properties where this part mixes well with water and this part tries to avoid water. And this is what makes up the membrane around all of our cells and even inside the cell around the organelles as well. So phospholipids, really important for that particular purpose. Now our last group is the steroids or sterols, and they're fairly different. I'm not going to try to draw that, but here's a picture of one, or several of them really, and these are what make up a lot of our hormones, but also they're incorporated into cell membranes as well. So cholesterol ends up inside of cell membranes, and then things like estrogen, progesterone, testosterone are a modified cholesterol, and these send signals around our body. This one's tough to recognize. It looks nothing like the other ones, but you will notice that it's mostly carbon and hydrogen with very little oxygen. It's just that those long chains have been bent into rings instead of into long chains. Well, there you have the three major types of lipids and what they do. I hope that helps.